Welcome to GM Tips. GM Rick here. I'm doing another in my series of different cultures and types of campaigns to incorporate into Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons or Shadowrun or any of the other types of games you want to run. So we've talked about Asia, we've talked about Africa, we've talked about Native Americans. So the next step of where I'm going to go, Native Americans including Central and South America. So it does have a Latin flavor somewhat to it, but it's not necessarily a European type of blend. So where am I going to go next? I'm going to go with Eastern Europeans because, again, sometimes Europe is included, but Eastern Europe is often not included in campaigns. There are some that do get it, some that don't. So some of you are going to go, well, what's the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe? Big differences. And why is that? Well, Eastern European type of influence has much more of a darker tone to it, more superstitious, a much more based in a darker, grayer world. If you've ever seen movies even that come out in those parts of the world, there is a darker side to them. And it's because of the various superstitions and legends that have come out of those cultures and how they viewed life. So keep in mind, Eastern Europe has been influenced by a lot of different factors. And so when you're designing a campaign that has more of a Transylvania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland type of flair to it, there is a real marked difference to it. And it comes from just the cultures themselves. Mind you that they were European countries and cultures that were Slavic in nature. In a minute, sweetie. Slavic in nature, and they also have a lot of influences that come from the Ottoman Empire as well as other places. So there was a lot of influence that went into these Eastern European countries, and they've been around a long time. In fact, in some cases, much more pronounced than the Western European tribes that were still tribal. The Eastern Europeans kind of developed a little bit sooner than Western Europe did. But they kept almost a gypsyish nature to them. And so when you're designing a campaign, keep those things in mind that, number one, superstition plays a huge part. So whether it's superstition about doing certain rituals to protect you from the dark or the night, or other critters that go bump in the night, whether it be fae or whether it be other types of things, the Eastern Europeans do that. And so when you design a campaign that has that type of flair, and I'm going to pick one here that's a perfect one that Paizo did. This was on Ustalav in the Inner Sea. Now, I'm not making this necessarily Ustalav specific. And by the way, Wes Schneider did this. Wes did a tremendous job of really fleshing out the people and how they are. And so I really give him a lot of credit to that. It was much more of a horror-esque type of things. Because you think about it, Frankenstein, the Nosferatu, even though it was a German film, it was more of an Eastern flair to it. The Dracula type of things, as well as the whole Dracul or Vlad Tepes type of flair to it, has a different feel. Yeah, I try to do my accent. I really do, because if you're going to speak the names, it's not Vlad, it's Vlad Tepes. It has much more of a flowing to it, and the way they pronounce things, they have other syllable that type of pronunciations we don't have necessarily in the West. So there was much more of this, even into their religion. And so even in the Eastern Orthodox type of religions that came around, whether it was worship of the fae in the forests, to other types of worship and religions, they were very much unique and different from the West. Much more like the Russian type of, not quite Russian, because they're not Russian, and they'll take real offense to that. So you can't model everything off of Russia unless you want that type of flair. There's much difference to them, but there's a richness in the culture. So again, superstition, little prayers, little rituals, little things to protect themselves. They believed in that. They believed in the ghoul and the ghast and the Nosferatu and the vampire and other things. These things, the lycanthrope, or the wares, the werewolf, or the were creatures, there's much more to that, and I know I'm butchering the language, but I'm trying. So there is much more of this. There was much more conquering going on in those times, and these empires were fighting off the incursions from Turkey, because Turkey and Turkmenistan and a lot of these other areas were coming in from the Caucasus to try to conquer this. Even since back around Chinggis Khan's time and Kublai Khan, these Eastern European countries have been fighting for their very existence and identity. So keep that in mind when you go in. Now, you don't have to necessarily bring that into your campaign, but the backstories kind of come similar to this. Like in this case, they did a very similar tilt to it, where gypsyish tribes called the Varishans moved across the plains and settled this area. And Saboida, oh gosh, what's his name? Hang on here real quick, and I'll tell you, because I love his name. It is Saboida Ustav was the founder of Ustalav. And so, under these type of things, this was the founder, and he was the head of this gypsy contingent that came across from Gorizia. And the Varishans have much more of the wayward nomad in them, and the flightiness. But they became a settled people. That's most how Eastern Europe did the same thing, and had a real tilt to how they thought and how they existed. So when you come up with your Eastern European flair, whether it's nomadic tribes, whether it was Caucasus tribes that came across into your world to where they are, it has that flavor to it. They're hagglers, they're barters, they are animated. They love music and dance. They love the arts. They are much, much into the arts as a people. So your operas and your singers and your bardic influences were just par excellence for them, and they loved it. Their leaders were of families, so the families that had the hierarchy over everything else. So there were ruling caste families, similar to like Asia, where they had the caste system. Eastern Europe had a similar type of system, the caste system. The lower class is the peasant class. Then there was the merchant class, or the tradesman class. Then there was the merchant class. Then there was the lower noble class, and then the nobles. And so when you build this up, make sure you emphasize the class system, because there was much of that going on. Now, there was, don't get me wrong, democracy. And one of the things they brought into here was a pseudo-republic type of democracy. There's nothing wrong with having some countries that do that and broke into more of a... But even in that thinking, they still kind of lean back to the old traditions and ways. So there was much to be said about family and tradition in these things. They love to be showmen and showwomen. So the colors are very colorful. But yet, even as you look at it, there's still a dark tone to them. So a blood red crimson color for their reds. Their purples being really rich purples. Not so much vibrant. Now, you can have your gypsy sides and your gypsy clans that can have much more of the brighter colors. It was all in how they looked at life. And life influenced them a lot of different ways. And so that's really what happened with their peoples. Now, again, they were constantly in a militia-based system because they couldn't depend on a main army to protect them often. So they trained their own into a militia-based system. And these militias would come together under counts or viscounts or other types of leadership in an era of paracounts. And they would come in and they would rule in a region and protect those people around them. But the militias would come together in times of need as a country as well. They didn't like each other necessarily. They competed with each other day to day. But they knew when the enemy was greater from the outside. And they would strive to protect one another. Religion and spiritualism was very much so. The tarot and card readings and harrowers, as they use in Pathfinder, or you can use it even in the modern things. The gypsyish flow from them and the tarot had almost a mystical, magical power to it. And so they looked at these things as their day-to-day lives, and they would look into the spirits of whether they would make it or not. and how prosperous they would be. So having that influence in there is kind of cool too when you build up a campaign like this. The whole, so for instance, in D&D, I'll pick the Curse of Strahd. That's a perfect look into a cultural area that is very much like Eastern Europe. So when you have Strahd, what was it, Zorvich, I think it is, was his last name. Strahd was very much that type of thing. If you look at Van Helsing and what setting they had there, that is the perfect setting for that. And I'm trying to think what else. You had Van Helsing, Frankenstein. Frankenstein was really good. That was again, they put it in an area like Dachau or one of those other areas which had that kind of influence into it. I'm trying to think of other movies. There's so many other movies. I mean, you can pick movies all the time. The Underworld. The whole Underworld series was based in an Eastern European country. And so I believe it was Slovakia or the Czech Republic. And so it had that real dark flair to it. And you can see just kind of the feeling of it. So if you're doing a modern, the Underworld ones are great sources for how you design your campaign around those type of things and how the different influences are. And even the Nordics were seen up in an icy, hold-away castle out in the middle of nowhere. And that's kind of how they were. And were vampires a part of the culture? Of course. Were boogeymen? Of course. Would something like Cthulhu be appropriate for that type of setting? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Very much lends to it. There was good in the area, but much of it was dark. Much of it was very dark. And so it had a dark tilt to it. Daywalkers was based in that type of a culture. And so it gives you the idea that even though people lived, they almost lived at the edge of gray. And that's the way their cultures were, and the way their culture is. But yet there's a vibrance to them as well. The history of family histories and knowing one's history and bloodline is really key in that type of setting. So going in and knowing your bloodline is very important. Lots of corruption and crime. So your gangs, your different types of criminal elements are very prevalent in that type of a setting. I hope I'm getting the juices going here with this. I know I'm going into picking ideas, but I'm trying to pull out things that will give you pictures in your mind. Because when you're writing a campaign, really as a GM, I believe you've got to have those pictures that you can build upon. You have to have the juices flowing, and sometimes you get it in your own mind, and sometimes you got to go to sources. So keep these sources in mind. And building a source library, it's very important. Now, having Fae and deep dark forests, absolutely. Eastern Europe is full of that. Your Babas, and not just Baba Yaga, but your other legends, where your Hansel and Gretel come from. And so these are important things to have when you design this. Even the children grew up with tales of threats. So when you're fleshing out your characters' backgrounds, having those mysterious, kind of tragic family backgrounds really sets the tone for that type of thing. And and again, communities were much smaller. They're not as big. Countries were not as big as they are in the West, because there was much more of a smaller regional influence with most of these countries than there are other places. And they distinguish themselves as markedly different. So keep that in mind as you're designing this campaign. You may have a conglomerate of 7 to 10 different countries, and they're all little countries that, like the Balkan region, where they all come together, but yet they're separate. And again, that's why I love it. If you want a setting to import into your campaign, think about Ustalav. Ustalav is a very wonderful setting, done very well by the Paizo publishing group. You don't have to necessarily get all the stats. You can take the background stuff and then convert it to D&D or to whatever system. It's just the rich history that's written there is so amazing that you could pretty much drop it into any country area you wanted to and put in the surrounding areas to be similar. And you can change a little bit of the history, but it really makes for a great setting. I have always loved to see a modernized steampunk version of this. because I think it would go really well. I think you'd have your death dealers and everything else. So I hope it gives you some things to work with. Again, another GM tips, a little bit shorter, but really look into these sources and really building a great campaign.